Good evening. On behalf of Countryside Community Church, we want to cordially welcome you all here to our event tonight. If you are a first-time visitor to Countryside Church, we want to especially welcome you, and you may be particularly interested to know about what's awaiting in case you have need. If you go out of the sanctuary and make a left, that's where the restrooms are located in our church. But also we want to welcome you and invite you to refreshments after the event as well in the foyer. If you happen to have one of these, if you wouldn't mind turning it to off or stun, that would be appreciated, so we may honor our speaker by hearing everything she has to say. Those of us who consider ourselves adherents of one of the three great Abrahamic faiths, whether it be Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, are reminded in our scriptures that our ancestor Abraham was a wandering Aramean. That's a reference to a great migration story of Abraham and Sarai out of the land of Ur of the Chaldees to the land of Palestine. Also, all three great faiths are reminded of a central migration story that took place by escaped slaves from Egypt into a land of promise. And within Christianity, Christians from the earliest times saw in the figure of Jesus as well another migration figure, one who led an inner migration from captivity into freedom that also had effects on providing justice for the poor and the denigrated in concrete terms. But in any of these cases, each of these migrations involve leaving oppression and finding freedom and hope and promise. So it's no wonder that we would be particularly interested in our speaker this evening, who shares another great migration story or stories, largely unknown to the majority of us in the U.S., even though that took place on our very soil, but one which joins with that great heritage in escaping oppression and following a promise. Well, I'd like to at this time invite Cindy Kugler forward, and she will introduce our speaker.
I join Eric and everyone here at Countryside Church to welcome you all to our final lecture in this series. The Center for Faith Studies has been hosting this series since 2004, beginning that year with a single lecture and building the series to now include 6 to 8 events per year. If you've been here before, we're glad to see you back, and if this is your first time, we hope we see you again. If you would like to be on our list for next year's brochure about our lecture series, please fill out the card in your program and leave it on the ticket counter out in the foyer. If you would like to see this lecture again after this evening, it should be up on the Center for Faith Studies website within a few days, and on the front of your program, the centerforfaithstudies.org website is right there. I want to recognize some very special people right now. First and foremost, let's give our guest Isabel Wilkerson a warm Omaha welcome. Next, I would just like to take a minute to recognize all of our co-sponsors for tonight's event. So, and just hold your applause till we're done. If you are connected to or have volunteered with Omaha Table Talk, would you please stand and just remain standing then? Come on, there's lots of you here, I know. Okay? If you are part of the teaching or student community at University of Nebraska Omaha Black Studies program or other disciplines there, would you please stand? Thank you. And if you are connected with or a supporter of the Great Plains Black History Museum, would you also stand? Let's thank all of these people who directly and indirectly served as co-sponsors for promotion for tonight. I am firmly of the belief that the more we can collaborate in town, the more we can accomplish for our community. I would like to thank you for not only honoring the request about your cell phones, but also to realize that we please can't allow any photography during the lecture or videotaping. However, you can take pictures in the foyer afterwards with Ms. Wilkerson. At the end of Ms. Wilkerson's presentation, we will have time for Q&A. If you will raise your hand, an usher with a microphone will come to you, and please do use the microphone so that Isabel and everyone can hear. Also, please think about your question in advance and use an economy of words so that we have time to get to as many people as possible. And my last request for the Q&A process is a little difficult, but it is important. We can only accommodate actual questions. Q&A is not the time for your personal stories. The reason this is so hard for me to ask tonight, however, is that I know that many of you in this room have deeply important and amazing migration stories of your own or those of loved ones. Omaha is a community founded and enriched through many decades by immigrants who came for a variety of reasons, and others who continue to come even today. Since tonight is a recognition of migration stories, we have an important opportunity for you outside of the Q&A time. On the back of your program, if you haven't already noticed, you will see that Leo Biga, a local writer, is collecting migration stories through interviews. If you would like to learn more about this opportunity and talk with Leo tonight about what is involved, please see him at the table next to the bookworm table in the foyer following our evening presentation. Also, when Isabel is finished and Q&A is finished, if you would let her leave first so that she can get through the aisle and be ready to greet you out in the foyer, that will work very well. The Center for Faith Studies has a deep and reverent regard for stories. We recognize the power in stories, noting that many, if not most, of our speakers depend on storytelling to move us and make their main points. Just in this past year, we had a speaker who told stories about the effect of September 11th on the many Muslim communities in our country. We had another speaker who used the concept of imagination to lead us through a new telling of the Good Samaritan story. Two of our speakers this year told personal and painful stories of their growing up experiences and environments, eventually leading each one of them to a new spirituality and relationship with God, and giving us much to think about. 2 months ago, we hosted an astronomer, a scientist spinning fact-based stories about the future of our universe and raising questions about how our faith accommodates and is enriched by advances in science. But in so many ways, I believe that tonight will be a grand finale to our year of stories. Hopefully, you've all had time to read about the astonishing work and achievements of our speaker in your program. And without delaying any longer, please help me welcome Ms. Isabel Wilkerson to the podium.
Thank you so much to everyone at Countryside Community Church. Thank you to all of the sponsors who made this possible. I know that there are many, many groups that come together to make such an evening occur. Airlines have to cooperate, and all of that has to happen. The weather even cooperated, and I'm so grateful to be here. I'm especially grateful because personally my career essentially began in the Midwest, and so to be able to come back to the Midwest, to come to Omaha, where I've not been here in many years since I was Chicago bureau chief of the New York Times, means so very much to me. I am thrilled to be talking about this book in a city that was one of the suns that attracted so many people seeking freedom from a caste system that's almost hard for us to imagine that existed and persisted for so long in the American South. And I ended up feeling so strongly about telling this story that I spent 15 years researching, reporting, searching out the people who would become the protagonists of this book, and ultimately then spending the time to write it. This is my copy of the book. It may look a little different from yours. Yours doesn't have these green things on it, does it? These are actually Post-it notes that were used by someone in the publisher's office to make sure that the person felt that I should mention all of these things whenever I talked about the book. And they had lovingly written a commentary on each one of these, and I haven't had the heart to remove them. And so they're now just essentially being torn apart over time. But in any case, this is my copy of the book. This book, were it a human being, would be in high school and dating. That is how long it took me to do this. I did not set out to spend 15 years working on a book. I did not know it was going to take that long. I don't think I would have even embarked upon it if I knew that it was going to take this long, so it's a good thing I didn't know. I don't regret having done it now that it's done, and I'm so grateful, I think more than anything, that I had the chance to meet the three amazing protagonists who make up this book, and then also the opportunity to meet so many people who share that story one way or the other, because this is truly a human, universal story that comes through, becomes alive through the experiences of the people in this book. The people in this book are proxies for someone in all of our families who had to have done what the people in this book did just for us to be here on this soil, at this place, at this time, because all of us, one way or the other, are descended from people who had to have come a long way away just for us to exist, really. Many of us are descended, how many of us know of or actually are descended from someone, a great-grandmother who migrated from across the Atlantic from Ireland and met and married a great-grandfather from Italy or from Germany or from Poland or from Lithuania or from Latvia or from the Ukraine or from wherever that person may have been, and created whole new lineages. That is what human beings do when they're seeking something better than what they have where they happen to be. And that is what these people did. I view this story as being one of the greatest underreported stories of the 20th century, and that is in part because the people did not talk about it. They didn't talk about what they had endured in the world that they had left. They often didn't tell their own children and grandchildren about all that they had experienced. And when they left, they almost left for good and didn't look back and didn't want to burden their own children and grandchildren with what they had endured. And so this remained a story that often was kept in the hearts and the memories of people for so long. And I chose to and decided to devote this time in order to try to bring to life the story while I still could. It was a race against the clock to get to them before it was too late. Now, this story involves 6 million Americans, 6 million Americans who left the land of their birth for, meaning the South, for parts all over the rest of the country. Every other state in the Union outside of the South became ultimately receiving stations for the people who were in some ways defecting a caste system. This was not a move in the way that someone might now move from Cleveland or relocate from Cleveland to San Francisco for a job relocation. This was in some ways a seeking of political asylum from a caste system that is almost hard for us to imagine now, because we're not that far from it chronologically, but we have come so far as a country that it's almost hard for us to even put ourselves in the mindset of the world in which these people have been forced to leave. This was the only time in American history that American citizens had been forced to or felt they had no option but to leave the land of their birth for other parts of their own country merely to be recognized as the citizens to which they had been born. No other group of Americans has ever had to make that heartbreaking decision to leave a place within their own country for another part of their own country just to be recognized as citizens. And yet they had to do this because they were living in a caste system which controlled their every move from the moment that they woke up until the moment that they went to sleep. A caste system is an artificial hierarchy in which people are assigned roles and positions, things that they can and can't do, based merely upon what they look like. And that is essentially what this caste system was throughout the South from the late 19th century until well into the 20th century, into the 1970s. And so this caste system was so arcane that it actually meant that it was against the law for a black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. Well, that was against the law. You could go to jail for playing checkers with someone of a different race. Now, that means that someone had to have seen a black person and a white person playing checkers in some town square, and perhaps they were having too good of a time. And someone saw that and felt that the entire foundation of Southern civilization was in peril and thought to themselves, we cannot have that. And actually took the time to write that down as a law. Throughout the South, there were in courtrooms throughout the South, there was actually a black Bible and a white Bible to swear to tell the truth on. The very Word of God was segregated. You wonder, how is that possible? The very Word of God, the sacred text of God, was actually segregated. Now, in writing this book and researching this book, I set about having this goal for myself that I wanted to make this era come alive for those of us alive today and for those of us yet to come, so that people could always remember what actually happened while it was still fresh in the minds of people and while the material was still there. There are no references in this book to the water fountains and the restrooms because we know about that already. Every school child learns about that, particularly during February, and so we knew about that. I wanted to show what was it like, what was it like to actually live under the strong arm and the cloud and the sense of fear and terror that at any moment you could be breaking some invisible rule that could actually get you killed. And this affected both blacks and whites. Blacks were the ones most likely to suffer the retribution, the violent retribution of it, but whites were not spared that either if they stepped outside the line and did something that was outside the bounds of the strict walls of the caste system under which they were all expected to adhere. And so I set about trying to find the examples that would make it come alive for us, to give us a sense of the ordinariness and the oppressive regularity of the reminders from the moment you woke up and the moment you went to sleep, that there was this hard and fast rule, this line in the sand across which you could not traverse. And so I spent a lot of time looking at the documents of the era, the newspaper articles and the magazine documents and the things that would have been written in that era to see what was being done and how did the people feel about it. So I came across this article in Raleigh, North Carolina, and in it, that's where I saw the headline about the Jim Crow Bible. And I just thought, how in the world do you segregate the Word of God? How could there be such a thing as a Jim Crow Bible? So I read the article, and it turned out that the article had not been written because there was a sense of alarm or embarrassment or shame at all about this law. It wasn't even announcing the law. The story had only been written because on that particular day, there had been a trial in session, and the trial had to be suspended because they could not find the Black Bible. Could not find the Black Bible. And that meant that the bailiff, the court officers, the sheriff's deputies all had to comb the courthouse and find that Bible so that the trial could resume. Now, you would think that on this one occasion, since the trial was already in session, and they did have a Bible, it's not like they didn't have a Bible, it's just the wrong Bible, if that can even be said. But that was not the Bible that this person was permitted to touch. But the judge specifically said, this is the state of North Carolina, this is the law of the state of North Carolina, find the Bible. And the trial could not be resumed until the Bible had been found. I've since been asked, well, were they different versions of the Bible? You know, maybe the King James for one group and the American Standard for the other group. And it turned out that they were the same version of the Bible, the same King James Bible. It's just that it was not permissible for the two races to touch the same sacred object. And that was the point of it. Now, I have had the pleasure and the honor of speaking so many places about this book. I'm so thrilled that there's been so much interest in this book throughout the country and even outside of the country. I've been from Alaska to the Netherlands talking about this. And it's always a joy to meet new audiences and to find that there are new connections that can be made to this particular migration, wherever the people happen to be from. But I always find that my most difficult and challenging audiences, always, as they say in the South, bless their hearts, are high school students, generally speaking. And that is because they are so delightfully, beautifully removed from this that they absolutely just have a very hard time imagining that human beings would do this to one another. And they really resist the descriptions of the things that I have to tell them. And so I found myself talking with a group of students in Hawaii. I've been to Hawaii as well talking about this. And the students, as I was telling them some of these examples, were a little, arms crossed and a little distant about this. And I was searching for what can I tell them, which example would get their attention to make this come alive for them. And it occurred to me what this population cared about a lot. And that is what led me to the example, which was already in the book, but told me that this one might work for them. Before I tell you what that example was and what their reaction was to it, I'd like to first see if I might get a show of hands from those of you in the audience who would be willing to admit to having done the following. It's not illegal, it's not difficult, it's not embarrassing. It's just that I'd like to see I'd like to get a show of hands of how many people might have done what I'm about to ask in the last week, let's say. How many of you have, within the last week, found yourself driving your car and you found yourself about to overtake a car in front of you? And so to avert an accident, you decided that, because that car was going much slower than you were, you decided to avert an accident, you would pass that person in another lane and then go on your way to avert an accident. How many of you have done that in the last week? Now, I see a few hands that didn't go up, and whenever I ask that question, I think, now you had to have done that. I mean, how do you drive without maybe passing somebody in the road? It's so very natural. It's the most natural thing in the world to do. In fact, you probably did it on the way here, if you think about it. And so, because it is the most natural, and it's actually the safer thing to do. But had you been African American throughout most of the South during the era in which this caste system was in effect, which began in 1896 with the passage of Plessy versus Ferguson and did not end until well into the 1970s. The 1970s, which for many people was just yesterday, really was not that long ago in the long arm of history. If you had been African American during that period of time in many parts of the South, it was actually against the law, against protocol and custom for a black motorist to pass a white motorist on the road, no matter how slowly that person was going. And I would submit that that might account for a couple million people being ready to leave right then and there. Because that really, if you think about it, that actually requires a level of patience and self-control that is almost beyond human capacity, because it is so natural to just want to do what is the safer thing to do when you actually are gaining on another passenger, another motorist. So I told this to the students, the high school students in Hawaii. And that got their attention. In fact, there was commotion throughout the whole classroom because they absolutely couldn't believe. Actually, if you think about it, driving is a very big deal when you're 16, 17 years old. And they absolutely were having none of that. They were so upset about the idea that had they been in that world, they wouldn't have been able to do that. And so they began to confer among themselves right in the middle of the talk. They started to confer among themselves. There was all this talking going on, and I asked students in the back, what was it that they were saying? And one student said, well, I would have honked. And I said, let me start again. Now, if you could not pass the people on the road, you couldn't honk to make them go faster either. And so they conferred among themselves again, and another one raised his hand, and he said, well, I would have tailgated. I wouldn't have made any noise. I wouldn't have made any noise, but I would have let them know they needed to speed up. And I said, if you couldn't pass the people on the road and you couldn't honk to make them go faster, you couldn't tailgate either. In other words, you had to stay in your place. That's what it means to be in a caste system. You must stay in your place. And so another hand went up, and that student said, well, I would have left then. And I said, my sentiments exactly. That is what 6 million Americans did during part of what we now call the Great Migration. Now, when they began to leave, they found that it wasn't always easy to leave. In other words, the South didn't make it easy to leave. And one reason the South didn't make it easy to leave was because the caste system, as I've described it to you, has many aspects to it, involving all kinds of things that were determinants as to how they decided how to divide up the world as they saw it. But at the underpinning of all that, at the foundation of this caste system, was essentially the economic imperative that was the guiding principle of how the South was operating for much of our history. And that was that it was dependent upon the land. And it was dependent upon having not just a supply of cheap labor, but an oversupply of cheap labor in order to work the land and to do the very hard work of managing, tending, and ultimately the biggest job of all, harvesting the cotton and the sugar cane and the tobacco and the rice, which were the lifeblood of the South. And that meant that in order to be able to have that oversupply of cheap labor, which would keep costs down and would make sure that people would be there at the ready during the ups and downs, the fallow periods and the busy periods of the land. The land does not always need people out at the same time, and in a uniform way. And so, in order to make sure that those people were there at the moment that the land required that they be there, they needed to have those people feeling as if they were tied to the land, tied to the region, and had no option but to stay. And in order to do that, there had to be this very fixed world in which they were in some ways rigidly almost held hostage in their own home region. And that was one of the main reasons why this caste system was developed in the first place. Now, the moment that all of this changed came with the start of World War I. And that's because during World War I, it was the North that had a problem. The North had a problem because it had been relying upon immigrants from Europe to work the factories and the steel mills and the railroads and the slaughterhouses of the North. And during World War I, however, because Europe was at war, that meant that immigration came to a virtual halt. And many people who were here already, many immigrants who were here already, were returning home to help with the war effort. And that thus meant that the North had a tremendous labor shortage at the precise moment that it needed more labor than ever before because of Europe's needs. And so therefore, the North set about trying to figure out what to do, and it decided that it would begin going to get the cheapest labor in the land, and that meant African Americans in the South, many of whom were working without being paid. They were working for the right to live on the land that they were farming. They were sharecroppers. They were not even being paid for their hard labor. And so they were ripe for recruitment. And that's how the first wave of people who arrived from the South to the North came at the express invitation of the North. They didn't just wander into Cleveland and to Detroit and Omaha. They came at the express invitation of the North. Now, when this recruitment occurred, it turned out that the Northerners were quite aware that they couldn't just go out in the open and start, pulling people out. They had to act in secrecy, which almost doesn't even sound like the United States of America. It almost sounds as if you have people going in to smuggle out people from behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. And that is exactly what it was like. They had to go in great secrecy, and they had to be very cautious, the Northerners did, when they went south to recruit. And the reason for that was because the South did not take kindly to this poaching of its cheap labor, not at all. The South did everything it could to keep the people from leaving. They would actually arrest people from the railroad platforms when they held northbound tickets. They would arrest people from the train seats. And when there were too many people to arrest, they would actually wave the train on through, so that people who had been waiting and hoping and praying and saving up what little they had for the chance to get to what they perceived as freedom had to watch that train to freedom leave without them and then figure out, how now will we get out? How now will we get out? I want to read to you a very short passage from an editorialist, one of the people from the planter caste, who was expressing the hand-wringing and the anxiety that was going on in the South at the time that this was occurring, because they were quite aware of the impact of losing their the cheap labor that the South had been relying upon. And so this is what this person wrote. This person happened to have been in Macon, Georgia, and he wrote, "Everybody seems to be asleep about what is going on right under our noses. That is, everybody but those farmers who have wakened up on mornings recently to find every Negro over 21 on his place gone. To Cleveland, to Pittsburgh, to Chicago, to Indianapolis," and he doesn't say it, but he could have said to Omaha. And they knew where they were going. Isn't that interesting? "And while our very solvency," listen to the language of the era, not people, but while our very solvency is being sucked out beneath us, we go on about our affairs as usual. So there was a tremendous amount of hand-wringing about what to do. One thing that's interesting, though, is that it never seemed to occur, I found no record of it occurring to them to maybe actually pay the people. I mean, that might have gone a long way toward keeping them from leaving, but that didn't seem to be one of the things that occurred to them. One planter made an announcement, made a statement to the Labor Department, which was actually monitoring this and wondering where this was going to lead, because, of course, while the South was in many respects a different country in its laws and its customs and in the caste system in its permutation of the caste system at that time, it was a part of the United States, and so therefore there were no turnstiles of customs that the people would have to pass. So they didn't need to have a passport. All they needed to do was to be able to get out, which was not an easy thing to do. But once they did, they could leave. And so the Labor Department actually sent people to talk with those in the South to get an assessment of what was going on. And one planter proudly told the Labor Department that he had figured out a way. He had figured out a way to keep his people from leaving, his workers from leaving. And he said, I've decided to put away my whip and my gun, and I think they'll stay now. Now that says so much. First of all, it says he was using a whip and a gun on free American citizens. Remember, none of this is about slavery. We are 3 generations from slavery by the time this migration begins. 3 generations from slavery. Many of the slaves had already, many of the slaves and the slaveholders have long since died in the era that we're speaking about. We're talking about free, putatively free American citizens, and this planter was acknowledging that he was using a whip and a gun on his workers. And that the other thing it tells you is he actually believed that by saying he was putting them away would be enough to make these people actually fall for the idea that he had changed. And neither of those things had worked. The people continued to go. In fact, the efforts to keep them from leaving only fed their desire to leave. Now, the thing about this migration is that, or the world that they were in, was that they were actually living in a world where any breach, any lack of adherence to the rules of this caste system were not merely, misdemeanors that could get you a ticket. These are things that could actually land you in jail, in peonage, or could even mean your life. People actually lost their lives for any perceived breach of the caste system, as I've described to you. Believe it or not, during the era that I'm speaking of, in the 2 decades leading up to the migration and the decade following it, every 4 days, this is a matter of life and death, every 4 days an African American was lynched for some perceived breach of the caste system, and not for the spectacular cases that we hear about in the Emmett Till case. But the more common reason for lynching was for this accusation, the accusation of acting like a white person, whatever that meant. Whatever that meant. That meant not tipping one's hat fast enough, not stepping off the sidewalk, failing to or forgetting to use the word sir or ma'am when they were addressing someone of the upper caste. Having the nerve or the gall to reach out to shake the hand of someone of the upper caste. It was said that this line was so total and complete that the majority of Southerners had never so much as shaken the hand of a person of another race. And so that's how extreme and severe the world of the caste system was. Now, at a certain point, they decided that they were going to leave. And it was as if they decided on their own at some moment in time, which would have occurred for any immigrant group any immigrant who's part of a wave of people leaving has to at some moment say, this and no farther, this and no farther. And so in this particular case, they decided to set out in 3 different streams. Every migration, wherever it might be, those that involve people coming across the Atlantic to the United States, coming across the Pacific to the United States, crossing the Rio Grande to get to the United States, or going from the south to get to the north and the west, follow beautifully predictable streams. In this particular migration, there were 3 beautifully predictable streams to such a degree that even to this day, when you're in one of the cities in the receiving cities of the migration, whether if you're in New York, if you're in Chicago, if you're in Detroit, if you're in Cleveland, if you're in Minneapolis, if if you're here in Omaha, if you're out in Los Angeles, wherever you might be, there are some differences now that people move around a lot more than they did before, but still, if you meet a native of one of these places, you will often find that you can tell where their people are from, where their ancestors are from, based upon where they happen to be in the north. And so therefore, the migration streams went in according to three routes. One was up the East Coast, which carried people from Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia, to Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New Jersey, New York, and Boston, and on up the East Coast. There was the Midwest stream, this stream, which carried people from Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas primarily, to Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Minneapolis, Omaha, and the rest of the entire Midwest, or getting to the Plain States. And then there was the stream that carried people from Louisiana and Texas to California and the entire West Coast. And that is just the way this migration went, beautifully predictable. I wanted to read to you how inspiring it is to think about the individual decisions of the people. This was a leaderless revolution. No one sounded the day or the hour that the migration should occur or had any control over how long it would last. These were the beautifully independent decisions of one person added to another person added to another person, who each decided independently through what was coming through in their heart and from answers to their own prayers as to what was the best thing for them and their family. It's almost as if they knew that for some, it occurred to them somehow that there are too many of us concentrated in this one place. Here, our work is devalued, our very lives are devalued. Perhaps we will fare better if we spread out throughout this land, and that is what they did. And so I had a great, wonderful experience of collecting works, excerpts from all kinds of literature and poetry and plays, and even from the Bible itself, to bring alive as sort of a Greek chorus to the experiences of the book itself. And so one of the things that I found was this passage from Jeremiah 8:7, which speaks so much to that moment when an individual has to make that decision, that moment of decision that had to have occurred in all of our backgrounds just for us to be here. And so it says, even the stork in the sky knows her appointed seasons, and the dove and the swift and the thrush observe the time of their migration. People just know when the time has come. And so I want to share with you a couple of things to put this migration in its historical context, to give us a sense of the magnitude of this migration. Not just the magnitude of it, but what it did and what it meant for our country, not just for African Americans, but for all people, and how it can be an inspiration, as any migration can be, for all of us. First of all, this migration was the first time in American history that the lowest caste people in our country signaled that they had options and were willing to take them. That single recognition was going to have an impact on the rest of the country. No other city in the North, Midwest, and West would ever be the same, ever. For good or for ill, it just was not going to ever be the same. And again, the South itself was not going to be the same after all was said and done. This was the first time in American history that the lowest caste people actually had a chance to choose where they would live and what they would do for a living. That had not been the case for the masses of African Americans throughout all of American history. That had never been the option. Certainly during slavery, that had not been the option. And even with the institution of this caste system, that was not an option. People were consigned to the work that their forebears had done even during slavery. If you were in cotton country, you were going to be primarily doing that, or you'd be working in, working in someone's home. You'd be scrubbing floors or working in the garden. You would be doing the work of the people from your group based upon what you looked like and the assumptions that were made about you based upon what you looked like. And this was the first time that they had a chance to actually choose for themselves what they were going to do for a living. That means, if you think about it, that there were actually people in those cotton fields, people in those tobacco fields, people in those on those sugarcane plantations and those rice fields, who actually were judges, playwrights, jazz musicians, opera singers, accountants, civil engineers. And why do we know that? We know that because that's what many of them and their children became once they got free of the caste system that had held them in a fixed place, only consigned to doing the work in the field. And that's why we know about that. You know, it's humbling and actually terrifying, actually, to think about the lost talent, generations upon generations of lost talent that went fallow for far too long, centuries, in fact. Who knows where we could be as a country had those people, millions of people, been able to be their fuller selves. And I'm not even speaking about just African Americans who were held under the thumb of the caste system. I'm speaking about those that seem to have been in the place of privilege, the white Southerners who were there. Because if you think about it, to maintain this artificial hierarchy, this artificial caste system, took a tremendous amount of effort, forethought. So remember, someone had to go and write that law about checkers, of all things. And if you think about it, and then on top of that, it requires a tremendous sense of violence, actually, to maintain so unnatural a system, because it's so natural for people to gravitate when they get a chance and have an opportunity to be exposed to one another, to find friendships and connections when they're given a chance to do so, and when the environment encourages them and fosters that kind of interaction. And so it took so much energy to maintain this caste system that meant that many of the white Southerners were not in a position to live up to their best, fuller selves. Because if you're going to keep someone else in a ditch, you have to get in the ditch with them. And that meant that was a lost potential throughout the entire region for centuries and for generations. And it's a humbling thing and it's a terrifying thing to think about all that might have been lost. But I want to focus in on the people who were part of this migration, because that's what animates me. That's the reason why so many people have been reading this book. That is the reason and how I end up hearing so many wonderful stories from people of all backgrounds when I talk about the book, and where I get so many wonderful letters and emails about it. So I want to tell you about putting yourself in the mindset of the people who were in the position of leaving, And of course, to be human in some ways is to migrate. To be human, to dream is to be human, and then to migrate is in some ways a reflection of the dream. And to act upon that dream takes so much courage that is really in some ways one of the highest forms of what a human being can do, I believe. Making the decision to leave a place that's a situation that's not good for you and go to a place that you hope will be better for you. And so I want to tell you about one family in particular that happened to have been in Alabama, and that's one of the states that would have been one of the sending states that would have, in which many people in Omaha would have connections to Alabama. That was one of the states that people came from. In this particular case, this is a family that was living on a plantation. They were sharecroppers. There were 9 or 10 children. The youngest child was about 9 years old when there was this debate among the family as to what should happen, what should they do. The youngest child was the one that they were so concerned about, because this youngest child was quite sickly. He was very small-boned. He was somewhat frail. They wondered how big he might get. He just wasn't growing very tall or very big, and they didn't think that someone like him would do very well in the field. In any case, the family had always had this fixation, because in that part of Alabama, there had been a fixation with a place called Cleveland. Each county had its own connection to a certain place, and for them, it was Cleveland. It could have just as well been Omaha, but it wasn't. It was Cleveland. In fact, they had such this fixation with Cleveland that they actually named that sickly, weakest son Cleveland. That was his name. His name was James Cleveland. And so they had always had this idea that Cleveland was a place of hope for them. They had never been to Cleveland. They'd never seen Cleveland. They didn't know anybody who had been to Cleveland, and yet they had heard about it, the stories that had come back that had been told around where they were from. Now, there was a great debate between the mother and the father about what they should do. The mother was convinced that they should go. The father was not so certain. So they went. You know who was running that household. Now, as they were beginning to pack up to leave, remember, they had never been outside the county into which they had been born. never been on a train. This was going to be a frightening thing to be going up to this big forbidding place. The father was so nervous, remember, he had not been so certain about the idea of going in the first place, that he actually was literally shaking and buckling in the knees at the idea of what was going to become of them. He didn't know how they were going to make it. And the little boy, the weakly son, youngest son, began to become alarmed and to notice this. He realized that this was a very serious thing that they were about to embark upon. The father was so nervous that his hands were shaking. He had to steady himself on the shoulders of his young son just to be able to get through the packing process. Well, they finally make it through, and they get on the train, and they arrive in Cleveland. And on the first day of this boy's first day of school, he goes to class, and the teacher asks him his name. And he tells the teacher what his name is. He was called JC by those in his family, short for James Cleveland. The teacher didn't understand him. He had a very thick Alabama accent, and she was from the North. And so she misunderstood him and just started calling him Jesse. And that is how Jesse Owens got his name. His name was never Jesse. Never was Jesse. His name was James Cleveland. And yet the teacher didn't understand him, and so she started calling him Jesse. He went home and told his parents about what had happened at school that day, and the parents never corrected the teacher, never ever stood up, never stood up to her. In fact, they started calling him Jesse too. They said to themselves, this must be what they do when you go north. They rename your children. And so this was an example of the magnitude of a migration. When you think about it, that sickly, wiry, thin-boned child was destined to do something other than being in the field. His talents would have been wasted forever. We would never know his name, either James Cleveland or Jesse, had his parents not made that heroic, that courageous, or really had the mother prevail, had the mother not prevailed in getting the family out. He then got the chance to go to Ohio State University, which he never would have had the chance to do had the family stayed in Alabama. He got a chance, obviously, to go off to qualify for the Olympics. The talent was within him. It just would have gone fallow had they not made this migration. He went on to make history that stands even to this day, of winning 4 gold medals in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, which were themselves symbolic because they were the ones that were hosted by the Nazis themselves. So how the magnitude of that single decision in that one family's case shows you the power of the individual decision. And this migration ended up being something that changed 20th century American culture as we know it on so many levels, because people who would never have existed had the chance to exist, meaning they were the products of migration streams who their parents would never have met. But beyond that, because they were now in a much freer place, far, far from perfect, as we all well know, but because they had the opportunity to go to a freer place, the children had a chance to benefit from what their parents could only even imagine. Migrations often occur for not the people who are doing the migrating, because for many of them it's almost too late. No matter where they are in the world, if they have suffered famine when they were growing up, if they suffered malnutrition as a result of that, if they'd never had a chance to see a physician, which is common for many, many people who have been part of any migration stream, it's almost too late for them by the time they get to migration age, which is pretty much by the time you get to your late teens and early 20s. Migration is something people do. It's a young person's experience. So it's too late for those who actually do the migrating. Many of them, as we know, may not ever really truly learn the language of the place that they adopt. But it's not too late for the children. And it's not too late for the unseen grandchildren. And it's not too late for the unseen great-grandchildren, which is where mostly everyone here, where all of us come in. Because those sacrifices that they made ultimately were for us. They may not have lived to see the fruit of all their labor and sacrifice, but we are the living embodiment of their dreams and what was on their hearts and in their minds as they made this migration. And so who are some of the people, what ended up happening to the people and the children of this migration? In this first, think about it, this was a watershed moment in American history when people, an entire population that had been held in a fixed place, suddenly had a chance to flourish and allow their God-given talents to come to fruition. That had never happened in the history of this country. At that moment when the migration began, you had 10 million African Americans. 90% of them were held hostage in this caste system that I've described to you. So that means 9 million people who were living at that time had not had the chance to actually live out to their fullest potential. Now they did. And people such as Toni Morrison is one of the examples of what happens after a decision like this is made. Toni Morrison, her parents were from Alabama. Had her parents not migrated, they went to Ohio, they went to Lorain, Ohio. Had her parents not migrated, she would not have been able to do what all of us now take for granted. She would not have been able to walk into a library and take out a library book. That was against the law for African Americans in Alabama and throughout the South at the time she would have been growing up. Merely by leaving, merely by that one decision to leave, her parents assured that their daughter would get a chance to get access to books, which she would never have had they stayed. And if you think about it, if you're going to become a Nobel laureate, it's good to get a book now and then. You know, it helps. So many other aspects of American culture, what we view to be American culture, are actually the culture of this great migration. Such things as all of the plays of August Wilson, for example. If any of you have seen the plays of August Wilson, every single one of his plays was about the dislocation, the heart sickness, the homesickness, the longing, the tensions north and south between those who stayed and those who left, the sense of identity that was still forming and being affected by the dislocation that had occurred as a result of this migration. Every single one of his plays was about the Great Migration. The piano lesson, in which there is a debate and a tension over what's to become of a treasured family heirloom, a piano, becomes an example of the tension over the identity that's being fought over by those who stayed and those who left. That's what happens whenever there's a migration. Who owns the culture and who actually best represents the identity? He himself would not even have existed had there been no Great Migration. His grandmother actually walked from North Carolina to Pittsburgh to get there. And her daughter later followed, and the daughter met a man from a completely different migration stream, the one from Germany to Pittsburgh, and there they met. And had those two migrations not occurred, August Wilson would not even have existed. So many other people would not have existed, but music as we know it was changed probably more dramatically than almost any other part of culture as a result of this great migration. We would be listening to music had there been no great migration, but I can assure you it would not be what we're listening to now. Motown itself would not have existed, simply wouldn't have. That's because the founder of Motown, Berry Gordy, his parents were from Georgia. They migrated to Detroit, and when they migrated, when he got to be a grown man, he decided he wanted to go into music, but he didn't have the resources to go all over the country scouting out the best talent, so what did he do? He looked around himself, and there he was surrounded by children who were first generation in the North, the children of the Great Migration. And they were growing up listening to the music, the folk music that had been brought on the hearts and in the memories of their parents, the blues music, the gospel music, the spirituals, and they were growing up with that. And as young people often want to do, they were reconstituting it into something of their own making. And so they decided to turn it into something else. And this man, Berry Gordy, saw these 3 girls, for example, in particular. One was named Mary Wilson. Another one was called Florence Ballard, and there was a third one who was known as much for her personality as for her voice. And I think you have an idea who I'm speaking. I'm speaking of Diana Ross. We would not know her name had there been no Great Migration. She wouldn't have existed. Her mother was from Alabama, father from West Virginia. They left their respective home states during completely different years, met in Detroit, married, had her and her sister, and thus a whole legend was born. This Berry Gordy also heard about this very, very large family in Gary, Indiana. There were 9 or 10 kids. There were 5 boys among the 9 or 10 kids. The youngest of the 5 was the front man for his brothers at age 5. And I think you know who I'm speaking of. I'm speaking about Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5. We wouldn't know their names had there been no Great Migration because their parents would never have met. Their father was from Arkansas. Their mother was from Alabama. They left during completely different decades, met outside of Chicago, married, had the kids, and created, there you have another legend that in some ways changed music or popular music as we know it. And jazz, as we know it, would simply not have existed. It is truly a creation of the Great Migration, starting with Louis Armstrong, who migrated from Louisiana to Chicago, but then moving to Miles Davis. Miles Davis, his parents he was born and raised in Arkansas, but when he was a little boy, his parents decided to move to Illinois, where he got the incredible luxury of time. The luxury of time that he would never have gotten in the cotton country of Arkansas, the luxury of time to be able to practice and hone the genius that was within him, the talent that was within him, but which would have gone fallow had it not been developed. And the same goes for Thelonious Monk, whose parents left North Carolina and they went to Harlem, to New York, when he was 5 years old, where he too got the luxury of time that would have been necessary in order to develop the genius that was within him all along, but which would have gone fallow had he not had the time and the luxury to pursue it. And John Coltrane migrated himself at the age of 17. He left North Carolina and went to Philadelphia, where, believe it or not, it was not until he got to Philadelphia that he got his first alto sax. And you wonder, where would jazz be if just that one man had not gotten hold of an alto sax? And we will never know whether he might have been considered by the ancestors to be the dud of the family. We will never know. Because that's what I mean by the loss of talent over the generations. All we know is what was able to rise to fruition once the people were free. We don't know what would have been within those who had never had the chance to be free. And so you wonder, what would jazz have been like? What would have happened had that man not gotten a hold of an alto sax? Where would jazz be? Where would music be? And where would culture be on the whole if all of these people that I've mentioned, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, this is just, depending upon how much time I have and what the audience is, I go through all different genres just to be able to make the point that these were gifts not just to American culture, 20th century culture. These were gifts to the world. Just the names I've given you, these people alone, and there are many, many, many others known, very famous people, these people are as revered in Tokyo and Amsterdam and Paris as they are here in the United States. These people were gifts to the world. And I want to just leave you with a couple of things to give a sense of the impact beyond just culture that this migration had. One of the impacts is that there would have been a civil rights movement had there been no Great Migration eventually. But it certainly was hastened by 6 million people in an advance guard that put so much pressure north and south that the entire country had to take notice, and particularly those in the North. The North, which had not really had to deal with this issue because 10% of African Americans were dispersed in tiny numbers in tiny patches throughout the rest of the country, and so it was not something that the North had really had to deal with. Suddenly, with the arrival of so many African Americans to places where they had not previously been in such large numbers, the North had to take notice of what was going on in the South. There had been resistance to this caste system for generations, if not centuries. But it was as if there were trees falling and no one there to hear them. Suddenly, with so many people in these big and influential places throughout the rest of the country, that is when the cameras went down. That is when the reporters went down, and they began to record what had been going on, and they sent those images out to the rest of the country and out to the world, and then, and only then, did change come. Ultimately, then, these people ended up changing the very region that they had been forced to flee. That tells you about the power of the individual decision. One person added to another person, added to another person, multiplied by millions, can actually change a country. And that is power. These are people who had absolutely nothing, very little in the way of education, no money, absolutely no money, very little in the way of exposure. Remember, there were no Google Maps to give them an idea where these things were. They couldn't go on Expedia.com or any of these other places to try to, scout out, well, what does Omaha look like? I mean, they had no way of knowing. It was a jumping off a cliff into the unknown. And that shows you the power of the individual decision. These people, by their actions, were actually able to do what a president of the United States could not do, Abraham Lincoln. They were able to actually do what both houses of Congress had not been able to do. They were able to do what the Emancipation Proclamation itself had not been able to do. They actually freed themselves. And that is power indeed. That's an unimaginable show of power by people who would have been seen as the least powerful in the entire country. And that should be an inspiration for all of us of just the beginning of what untapped power and potential we each may have too when we think about it. And I want to leave you with two things. One is the moment of departure. This is the moment when again, as I said, this is migration as a young person's experience. This is the moment when a young person has made the decision that they cannot stay here any longer and they must leave. And in that case, at that moment, that young person has to go and board a ship or board a train or catch a bus or load up a truck or the trunk of a car for a long journey across the country, far, far away, or across an ocean. And so that young person is there at that loading dock about to cross the Atlantic or the Pacific. That young person is loading up the trunk of their car to cross the Rio Grande. Or that young person is standing at a railroad platform somewhere in the South, headed north for a place called Omaha, or Detroit, or Chicago, or New York, or wherever it might have been. And with them at that railroad platform, or at that dock as they're about to board a ship, are the people who raised them, their mother, their father, their grandparents, their aunt, their uncle, whomever it might have been who brought them to that point. And at that moment, on both sides of that moment, each side knew that there was no guarantee that they would ever see one another alive again. Think about it. For the older people there, they could not make the crossing. They would not have been able to perhaps endure the crossing across the Atlantic or be able to make a way for themselves in these forbidding, hostile, and busy, anonymous cities of the North. They could not make the crossing with them, and there was no guarantee that either side would ever see one another alive again. Remember, there was no Skype, no email, no cell phones, not even reliable long-distance telephone service, and even if there had been, many of the people that they were leaving didn't have telephones. This was going to be a complete break from all that they knew and all that they loved. And the next time that that young person might hear about the person who had actually raised them and gotten to them to that point would be a telegram saying that their father had passed away or that their mother was very ill, and that if they were to see her alive again, they would have to come back quickly. That is the magnitude of the sacrifice that had to have happened in all of our backgrounds just for us to be here today. And that means that as a result of the sacrifice that they had to make, it gives us a tremendous responsibility, a joyful obligation, however, and a sense of gratitude, one would hope, that it is our pleasure, and in my view, honor, to make their sacrifice mean something, because we have so much more than they ever could even have dreamed of. And therefore, their sacrifice has to mean something, and it's up to us to make sure that we make the most of it so that we leave this world a better place. And I want to close with the words of one of the people who was one of the most famous novelists of the 20th century, African-American novelists of the 20th century, and also one of the best-known people who was a part of this great migration. His name was Richard Wright. He was a novelist, and he wrote Native Son, and he wrote a lot of nonfiction as well. Every single thing that he wrote about was about the effort to understand the heartbreak and the homesickness and the longing and all that was gained and lost by this migration that he had been a part of. And he wrote these words as he was reflecting upon his moment of departure, as he reflected upon how he felt when he was about to leave Mississippi in 1927 for a place called Chicago. And these words are in some ways a wish, a dream, a prayer that actually apply to us today, wherever we might be on our own journey, because he was about to jump off a cliff. He was about to go off into the unknown, not knowing what the future might hold, and he had to somehow find the faith within him to make that leap anyway. And so this is what he wrote. He wrote, "I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps just perhaps, to bloom. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much. How wonderful. We have some time for questions. There's a hand in the back. Right there. There's a hand right there. Yeah, 2 hands.
And is it on? Okay. I appreciated your positive bent on this whole migration you're talking about. What I'm shocked by and kind of saddened by is that, I mean, this is exciting, but in your bio it says that you were the first black woman to get, in American journalism, to get the Pulitzer Prize.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw an interview of Magic Johnson this week, and he's the first black man to buy a baseball team, the Dodgers. And I think those are exciting, but I'm like, it's 2012. As a child of the 60s and 70s, I would have thought this would have happened maybe in the 80s, the 90s. And so you're a person who observes groups of people, masses of people. Do you see things slowing down, speeding up? How do you see this?
It may be a matter of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I think that when you look at the long arm of history, you know, Dr. King always said that it was moving toward justice, but it didn't always move as fast as one might like. I think that we've come a very long way when it particularly comes to the laws that were so arcane and feudal, actually, and both uses of the term feudal, F-U-I-T-I-L-E, and feudal, F-E-U-D-A-L. Both of them seem to apply. And I think that we've come such a long way and that we now have, you know, on the books, the laws appear to be more fair than they have. We still have issues with many laws. It still, in some ways, seem to be remnants of that. But things are so much better than they were before. But we still have much farther to go because we still have many great gaps, and we do not have the same access to opportunity throughout our country, and so I think we have a long way to go, and these first still are a reminder of the barriers are still being walked across even to this day, and it is sobering to realize that, but also a moment to celebrate because at least that's one more barrier that's been crossed. Another question.
I know you did 15 years of research, and I was just wondering, in that 15 years, is there ever a story that you came upon that you felt was too harsh to publish? And do you also have one story that you gladly speak about at every occasion when you're speaking?
Could you repeat the last part of the question? I heard the first.
Is there ever a story in your research that you always are gladly to talk about every time you speak in public?
Oh, that I'm happy to talk about? Yes. Well, first of all, there are some. The book is about 3 people who represent the 6 million who ultimately, in my view, are proxies for anyone and all of our backgrounds who had to do what these people did, because in some ways the psychology and the emotions and the sense of homesickness and heartbreak and dislocation is something that's common to anyone who has to experience this. And so in telling the story, I wanted to focus in on what it was like to be these people and make them come alive for the reader. In doing that, that meant I also had to not only just tell their story, but also give examples of some of the reasons why, some of the harsher realities that are necessary, I think, vital for us to understand things that happen in our own country that we often associate with other countries. And so I actually didn't find myself pulling back. I mean, I think most of the reviews indicate that there's not, I don't pull punches in it. I mean, things happen and they happen and people live through them. And if other people could live through or endure these things, surely we, now so removed from it, can, read a couple of pages about something that someone had to endure. So I didn't feel as if I was holding back in that respect. I think it was just a matter of making sure that all of these things were cohesive and they were moving the story forward, and I get the sense that people feel that way. Are there stories that I like to tell? I mean, I love these three people. The people are tell you a little bit about them. One is, the first one to leave was a woman who had been a sharecropper's wife in Mississippi, and one of the things why I was drawn to her the very first time I spoke with her was she admitted to me, and these are beautifully flawed people. Nobody is perfect, and they aren't either, and so this is not presenting people as being perfect. You can be a flawed hero, and that's what they are, and I think we all have flawed heroes in all of our background, and it shows you that anyone actually can be a hero. It's how you define it, and these were very courageous people. But one of the things that she told me when I first met her was, she said, I spent all this time in the field. My father, we all raised cotton, but I was terrible at it. I was just terrible at it. She was terrible at picking cotton. You don't think about people being good or bad at it. You just do it. And yet she was terrible at it, to a point that it almost became a problem in the family being able to get what it needed to get done. But that wasn't why they left. They actually left because a cousin of her husband's had been beaten to within an inch of his life, and as a result of that, her husband felt that they had to leave themselves in order to remain safe, and so that's why they left. They left in 1937, and they ultimately ended up in Chicago. A second person had been in Florida, and he had a few years of college, and the money ran out, and he had to return to the work of the people in the part of Florida that he was from, which was Central Florida, and that meant picking fruit, citrus fruit, which the rest of the country, we often take for granted, but somebody has to pick it, and so that we can have orange juice in the morning, and he was one of those people who did that. The work was dangerous. They had to climb into 40-foot trees, which means 4 stories high. They could easily fall on a limb and become disabled as a result of that, but that was just their bad luck. There was nothing that they were going to get as a result of that, and the pay was even worse. And so he began to try to get the people to band together to get better work conditions and a little better pay, a few pennies more a box for the work that they were doing. And for having done that, he ended up having to flee for his life because he had actually gone up against a caste system that did not allow African Americans to negotiate with the planters in that way as equals, and he could not. He had to leave. He had to flee for his life, and he went to New York. There was a lynching that was planned for him, and so he had to leave. And then the last person to leave, he left in 1945. The last person to leave left in the 1950s. He had been a surgeon in the Army during the Korean conflict, but when he got out of the Army, it turned out that he could not practice surgery in his own hometown of Monroe, Louisiana. And so he set out on this perilous journey to cross a good portion of the country just to get to what he perceived as freedom. And so to answer your question about the story that I always enjoy telling, it would be the story of my attempt to recreate that journey. He had had great difficulty getting across the country because, many of his friends would say one reason was because he was a terrible driver, which he was, and a lot of them were in wonderment that he could have even made it out of the state of Louisiana. But the problem that he faced on top of that was that he and millions of other people during that era were not permitted to stop to get food. They could not be assured of getting food at restaurants. Many restaurants would not serve them. Many gas stations would not sell them gas or ice if they needed it for their radiators. And worst of all, many of them could never be assured of being able to find a place to stay for the night, could not be assured of a hotel room. Many, the majority of hotels and motels would not rent rooms to them when they were on their journeys, and therefore he had to drive for several states of the West without sleep. He had not anticipated. He thought he'd be able to stop after he got out of Texas, and that did not end up being being the case. And so we had a harrowing journey driving without sleep in the pitch darkness through the hairpin curves where you're going north and south as much as west. These were before interstate highways, so that you had these tiny roads. There were no lights. There were very few cars on the road. And there he was trying to make it through the desert by himself in the mountains. And I tried to recreate that. He was driving a Buick, and he would tell you before you say anything about a Buick, he said you would want it too if you had seen it. It was a Buick Roadmaster, not just any Buick, but a Buick Roadmaster. And I rented a Buick as he had in honor of his journey. I had my parents with me. They had been part of this migration. They had lived through this era, and they were retired and were always up for an adventure. They knew the rule was that they couldn't help me drive, because he had been driving by himself. He didn't have anyone in the car, and I was trying to recreate that to the letter. And so we were following along the route that he had followed, and we got to the part where the road got vicious and mean, and it was pitch dark, and you can't see barely in front of you. There were, hairpin curves and mountains, and I began to veer off the road. You're talking two-lane roads that were hugging the side of a mountain, and that's very dangerous if you're falling asleep at the wheel. At that point, my parents said, "Stop the car. Stop the car, and if you won't stop, let us out." And so, having a mutiny on my hands, I decided I would, go along with them. And we stopped only as long as it took to make them feel a little bit better, that I might have had enough time to get catch a little bit of sleep, and until we took up the task again, because I didn't want to be getting off track with what he had done. He actually had a chance to pull over. He'd been forced to kind of pull over whenever he could, and that was the best that he could do. And being able to stop, we stopped in a hotel in Yuma, Arizona. We had no trouble finding a place, because this was no longer 1953, and we've come such a long way, even though we still have a long way to go. But we had no trouble finding a place, and that actually made me feel even more empathy for what he and millions of others had to endure, because they had not had that option. They had to push through and risk an accident, or sleep on the side of the road and risk being broken into, or whatever might have happened, and they didn't have that option. That made me feel even more empathy for it. So that's one story that I am always happy to tell. Any other questions? Yes.
I've been quite impressed with the book and the passion that's in it, and the courage of everyone, and the vividness of their experiences, and I appreciate very much your writing. As I'm listening and reading the book, what I'm thinking about is another group that was forced to migrate, and that's the natives. And I'm wondering if you have had some conversations or some thoughts, or run across some things where you can see where the experience that you're explaining in Warmth of Other Suns is going to inform the native experience as they try to find their own way into their culture, into their identity, and into their place in America.
Well, I do see, comparisons between the Native experience. I actually see comparisons between, in terms of a forced migration. As I talk about this great migration, anyone who knows American history knows that, of course, there was a previous migration for African Americans, and that was forced across the Atlantic in the transatlantic slave trade. And so that is one of the sad commonalities as well between a forced migration that the African Americans experience, or the Africans who then came to this country and became African Americans, and the natives who, of course, neither one of those things should have happened. Those are atrocities to both groups. The reason why I speak about this migration being different is because this migration was the first time that the people who had been forced here in the ways that you're speaking of actually chose to leave. So the agency that attends this migration is what makes this distinctive, and which is what I find so inspiring about this migration, which is why I mentioned that. Yes, there's a question. Oh, okay.
Okay. You spoke a little bit about Thelonious Monk.
Yes.
And as I thought about the Harlem Renaissance and many of the artists and musicians and writers of that time, how many of them in your research did you come across that came from the South or had connections to the South?
Oh, well, the majority of them, like Zora Neale Hurston, she was from Florida, and she went to New York. I mean, many of them, James Weldon Johnson was from Florida, and he went to New York. So, I mean, that is where people came from. I mean, the Harlem Renaissance is one subset, actually, of the Great Migration. And that's the reason why I wanted to write about this, because the Great Migration suffuses almost all that we talk about when we speak about African American culture in the 20th century. It's everywhere. It's in Lorraine Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun. That play is actually about the migration. It's about people who had been in Mississippi, migrated to Chicago, find that the head of the household has passed away, and thus they are left wondering, what now shall they do? They're in this, alien place, alien world where they're trying to make it. And so, so many of the best known aspects of African American culture, which is American culture, actually grew out of this Great Migration. Some of them were direct commentaries on the Great Migration. Invisible Man, which is written by Ralph Ellison, viewed as one of the great novels of the 20th century, is about the Great Migration. It's about a young man who leaves Alabama and goes to New York and finds that he finds himself invisible. It's about the other side of what happens when they arrive and how they had such a difficult time finding a way for themselves and making a way for themselves in this hostile, forbidding land. So some of the greatest works of 20th century literature, particularly urban-related literature, theater, music, were all part of the Great Migration. And of course, here, and would not have happened had there been no Great Migration. So that in some ways, 20th century culture actually is in some ways the culture of the Great Migration, because it had been brought by the people, and then it flourished and informed much of the art and culture that we view as American culture. But of course, there were other aspects of it, and of course, being in Omaha, I have to mention one of the people who would never have existed had there been no Great Migration. But Malcolm X would not have existed had there been no Great Migration. I mean, he was born here in Omaha in 1925. His father was from Georgia. He was a product of this Great Migration. His mother, he actually was a product of two different migration streams. His mother was from Grenada, and they met in Canada and then came here. And so you can see how the impact of this migration created people who never would have existed. And the legacy of that man, who is revered in many parts of the world, not just in the United States, but is recognized throughout many parts of the world, primarily because of the transformation that he made in the later years of his life, is an indication of the impact of a single decision, the decision of one man to leave Georgia. And then he comes here, he comes north, and he ends up becoming the father of one of the best known, most famous people who's ever lived in this country. And so, and of course, the country was impacted by his being here. The country was impacted by him during the Civil Rights era. You had Martin Luther King, who represented one way of approaching what needed to be dealt with, which was human rights abuses occurring in this country. And you had another philosophy coming from Malcolm X. And the two of them were very likely necessary in order to all these things that occurred. Rosa Parks and the great migration of people defecting from that area, from that part of the country. Everything was necessary. It shows you all that was necessary just to free an entire people. And so this migration is pretty much everywhere in 20th century America.
Do you have a view regarding the major factors that have led to the extraordinary change in the U.S. over the past 50 years? You talked about the caste system being in place through the early 70s. What happened from then to now to make things so different?
You mean to make things open up for people, or do you mean to things didn't change as much as they might have? Which do you mean?
I mean, how much they've changed.
Oh. Well, I mean, the thing that's interesting about the results of this, of the changes, the change occurred when the laws actually were overturned with the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, 65, and 68. However, and of course Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s, but because the South had become in some ways so entrenched and so stubbornly insistent on maintaining the order that they'd had, and of course during the Civil Rights Movement, things, which I prefer to call the Human Rights Movement, things got so much worse because it was sort of the last gasp of whatever might have been necessary in their view to maintain it. Things got even more violent and more difficult. But then when the laws came into place, the South still resisted, and that's the reason why I say that this caste system existed into the 1970s, even in spite of the laws, because the South did everything it could to still resist the implementation of these laws. When the schools in the South were ordered to desegregate, what people in the South did was they actually created academies for the white children to go to, so that they were defying the law, but not doing so in a way that would get them into trouble, they thought. In one school district in Prince Edward, Virginia, they actually shut down the school system rather than just so no one could go to school theoretically. So for 5 years, African American students just were not able to go to school. They had to move in with relatives in other counties. Some of them just didn't go to school for 5 whole years. And meantime, the whites in that county created an alternative school system, private schools, which then would not have fallen under in their view, the law that had been made in place. So what I'm saying is it was a fitful, slow adjustment to the changes that occurred, and just because you have laws change does not mean that hearts change. And so, and as a result of that, I don't really say that the caste system itself is over. I think we still live with the after effects of the caste system. The caste system was built on the idea that there were certain things that certain people did, there are certain things that were appropriate for some people, not appropriate for others, and it takes a long time to overcome those assumptions and those prejudgments, and when it's been going on for so long. And so I wouldn't say that, that we're where we need to be, but we're much better than where we were.
Okay.
Thank you very much for coming, because you've helped me to connect a lot of the dots and questions, but I've had the experiences, so I know that everything you've done in your research is really right on the money. In your travels, have you come across West Indians? And is there a book that I could find so I could hear what that side is about coming to America? I know some of the reasons are literally they came because they said the streets are filled with gold, meaning golden opportunities. And that's the reason why most West Indians came to America.
Well, of course, many of the countries in the Caribbean were colonial entities, and therefore they would have been dealing with, in some ways, some of the same caste issues exist in the Caribbean as in the United States. And I view, I say it all the time, and I say it because I mean it. I view I view every migration as having more in common with one another than they are different. Because people are making the tough decision to leave all that they know for a place far, far away with no guarantees of success, where failure is not an option, and therefore they have to work so hard in order to make a way for themselves. And I think one of the tragedies of 20th century life as this migration was unfolding is that when all of these different groups of people were arriving in these big cities and states of the North and the West, that they were not recognizing how much they had in common. All of these people were pretty much the same people. When you speak about the migration from the Caribbean to the United States, to the big cities, people coming from the southern part of the United States to the big cities, particularly with African Americans, they were in some ways the same people. How they got to the South or how they got to the Caribbean had to do with where the boat the transatlantic boat left them. So their migrations are often very, very similar, and I don't see I don't see them being as so wildly distinctive to be viewed as not having things in common. I think that there are many writers of Caribbean descent, such as Edwidge Danticat, who have written about these topics, and I think that there are some options to do that. This is a book that tries to focus on real people. It's nonfiction. It's narrative nonfiction, which means that it has protagonists, as in any novel. It has a storyline that you're following. You're wondering what's going to happen to them, as you would in any novel. And it asks the question, what would you have done? What would you have done had you been in the position of these people? And so one of the things that I think is that I would hope people would take away from it, and that I have had the joy of seeing that this is truly possible, is that one of the sad things about the 20th century is that people coming in from all of these different places in the late 19th century and the early to mid 20th century were often the same people. They were people of the land. They were people who had come from small towns and from farms, whether those small towns and farms were in southern Italy, or they were in a county in Ireland, or whether they were someplace in Georgia or in Tennessee or in Jamaica. They were all, or parts of China. They were all people coming from many of them were coming from the countryside. A lot of times the people from the big cities were not the ones who were leaving. These were often rural people who were trying to make a way for themselves. And imagine what it must have been like for them to be arriving, and they ended up going to some of the biggest and most expensive places on the planet. I mean, to go from Alabama to New York, why? You think about that, and yet so many people did. And if you can imagine, I mean, anybody in this room who goes to Manhattan today recognizes, you have to be you have to be thinking, now, which platform do I go to catch the A train or the C train or the E train, and which one do I get off of? And I want to change trains. I'm on the express train, and I meant to get on the local. I mean, that's just the trains. And we have so many more, we have Google Maps. I mean, again, thinking of all the advantages that we have. And to have arrived from southern Italy, to have arrived from Poland, to have arrived from Ireland, to have arrived from Alabama or Georgia or Florida or South Carolina from a farm, and find yourself in these big cities, I just look at them and I have nothing but respect and honor and gratitude and amazement at the courage that it had to have taken for them to have done that. And so when I say that, I see them as having so much more in common. And I think, all credit and affirmation should go to all of them for what they did and what they have bequeathed us. And that's how I look at that. Yes.
Let's do one more question.
Okay.
I want to thank you for your research, your journey, and for preserving these experience stories. I have not read your book yet, but I wanted to ask anyway, being that northern cities were not exempt from segregation, racism, and hate crimes also, do you feel that the stories that were in the book included kind of a true or somewhat realistic depiction of the adversities that they came across, and what other families would have experienced in the North as well?
That's a great question. What I've talked about today was about the motivations and the circumstances of their departure. What I have not talked about is what happened to them when they got there. And what you've described is accurate, and in fact, just the tip of the iceberg of what met them when they arrived in the North. Not only did they experience hostility, they experienced heartbreaking realization that while they were freer and there were many things that they could do here that they could not do back home, there were also, they could get paid for their work even though they were being underpaid compared to other groups. They were still the lowest paid wherever they went, openly, without apology. But they experienced all kinds of limits and restrictions even here. They could walk freer without having to worry about a lynch mob, but they also could not be assured of getting into unions. They were not permitted into unions, and therefore that's one of the reasons why they were making much less money. They were living in, forced to live in roped-off slums and were not permitted to actually to leave by multiple things that would have been barriers. One of them were restrictive covenants, which meant that white white homeowners who wanted to sell, those white homeowners who would have wanted to sell to them, by law were forbidden to do so. So you could say there was a caste system that they ran into here, and that there were laws in place that meant that preserved the caste system as existed in the North and in the West as well, that were as limiting in different ways. They also ended up, the places that they were consigned to live were the red light districts of the cities that they were in, meaning they arrived and had no choice but to live in the red light districts of the places that they were living. Remember, they did not necessarily create the red light districts. That is where they were consigned to live. How do you raise children in a place where you have open prostitution and gambling and all of that is permitted there, and people from other parts of that city come to that area for that? People don't even live there. People of other castes coming in there to partake of the activities in the red light district. And so those were some of the things that they came across. Then, on top of that, whenever they did try to leave, they were met with ferocious hostility and violence. There were reports open reports, I mean, these are covered in many newspapers, and I make reference to some of them, spectacular shows of hostility, by many of them by people who were the same people who come from other parts of the world, rural areas. If only they could recognize how much more they had in common, that they actually were the same people. And so they were met, when they tried to move into white neighborhoods, they were met with fire bombings. They were met with, there was rioting in a place called Cicero, Illinois. There was beyond belief what happened in that particular case. In that particular case, a couple were trying to move into the apartment in Cicero, and this is 1951, not that long ago, within the living memory of many people alive today. That couple could have been in a cereal commercial. They were just, the people in the 50s just dressed better. That's just all you can say. I don't know, I mean, they just dressed better. I mean, she had hats, the gloves, and the whole thing. He had on a suit and tie. I mean, just going to, fill out the rental form. And so they looked like they could be in a cereal commercial. When they tried to move in, they were met by the sheriff, who would not permit them to go in. You think of the sheriffs in the South? Well, there was a sheriff in the North that was preventing them from being able to move in. They had to get a court order to permit them to move in. They actually were able to get their things into the building, the second floor of the apartment building that they were seeking to move in. They would have been the only black people moving into this area. They, however, could not move in the night that they got their things in. They had to leave because a mob of nearly 4,000 people, some of them in Mamie Eisenhower swing coats, were out there to keep them from moving in, which is astounding. They had to leave, and that night, that mob stormed the building, stormed the apartment, threw all of their belongings out, the sofa, the chairs, they had a little piano that they had saved up for their children. They had two little children, 9 and 5, and they hurled the piano out of the second floor window. When they had finished with that, they then yanked the fixtures out of the wall. They took the faucets and the toilets and the radiators and hurled them out of the second floor window. When they had completed that, they still were not through, because see, mobs are not, they're not rational, so once you get going, you can't stop. And they were not through. They then burned down the entire building, leaving the white residents there homeless. And so that is the extreme. That is what they meant. And so, no, this is a depiction. This is a full depiction of what they experienced, of what happened, not just what they experienced, but of the misunderstanding, miscommunication, and the lost opportunities, and the loss of innocence, and the wasted energy. What a waste of energy, truly, a waste of energy on all sides. In the middle of all this, but I want to leave you on a high note. I want to leave you with this story of talking to a group of people on Long Island in New York. It was an evening like this, except it was bitterly, bitterly cold and rainy, and it was a miracle and lovely that so many people turned out. At the end of that talk, which was at a library on Long Island, there was a long signing line that essentially went along the perimeter of the room. And at the front of the signing line was a grandmotherly figure, a grandmother who had managed or maneuvered or whatever she did to get at the front of the line, had cut maybe, in front of the line. She had in her arms, she had an armload of books that she was cradling in her arms, and she stood there before me, the first in line to get her book signed. And as she stood there, her eyes had welled up with tears. And she began to tell me about how much she loved the book, and she said, I love the book, but I just can't talk about the book. She said, I cannot talk about the book, because if I talk about the book, I'm going to cry for sure. She said, I can't talk about the book because the book is my story. You see, I'm an immigrant from Greece, and the book is my story. And at that moment, I realized that the connection that would have been so wonderful to have occurred decades ago was possible. Obviously, it's possible. We know now today that it is. But it had been made possible because she had been able to see herself in people who, in another time and place, she would have been perhaps assuming, or maybe would have been told she would have had nothing in common with. And yet she saw that she had so much in common with them, that she was standing there before me teary-eyed because it had been her story. She'd also dragged her husband and her son and her daughter there, who did not have a clue as to what was this big deal. We're going out in the rain, it's nighttime, and you're dragging us here, and yet she insisted that a photograph of us be taken, and there she is cradling her books in one hand and clutching me in the other. And I want to leave you with that note, because that shows you the potential and the power of recognizing that we all have so much more in common than we've been led to believe. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. We expected a grand finale tonight, and I don't think we've been disappointed one bit. I understand there were 20 more people in the line to ask questions, so that we would have been here till midnight. Instead, we're going to let Isabel make her way out first, and then we will join her out there and for more time to visit with her. But please let her go first. Okay?